The October morning in Columbus, Ohio still held traces of summer's warmth. Margaret Harris hurried down the hospital corridor, her footsteps echoing as she rushed toward her son's room. It had been nearly 2 months since 4-year-old Ethan was diagnosed with acute leukemia. "Good morning, Ethan," Margaret said as she entered the room, placing her palm on her son's forehead as he lay in bed. His fever seemed to have broken. When Ethan looked up at his mother's face, he gave her his usual friendly smile. "Mommy, isn't Daddy coming today?" "Daddy has an important meeting at work. He promised he'll definitely come this Saturday," Margaret answered, gently stroking her son's cheek. Margaret and Robert had been married for 6 years. They first met when Margaret was working as a librarian at the local library. Robert was a project manager at a construction company, overseeing the library's renovation. During the months of construction, seeing each other daily, the two naturally grew attracted to one another. Margaret was drawn to Robert's sincerity and strong sense of responsibility, and she accepted his proposal without hesitation. After their marriage, they purchased a small house in the Columbus suburbs and lived a peaceful life. When Ethan was born, Margaret left her librarian job to become a full-time homemaker, dedicating herself to caring for their son. On the surface, they were the ideal American family. They attended church on Sundays, maintained good relationships with their neighbors, and enjoyed camping by Lake Michigan every summer. However, everything began to change after Ethan's illness was discovered. The treatment costs were higher than expected, and Robert's income alone was making their finances tight. Margaret began looking for part-time work, but caring for her sick son made it difficult to work regularly. What puzzled her even more was Robert's recent behavior. Her husband, who had previously treasured family time above all else, increasingly went out on weekends citing work emergencies. He also began coming home late on weekdays more often, returning exhausted. "Mommy, when I played with Daddy before, it was really fun," Ethan suddenly spoke up. Margaret stopped what she was doing. "You played with Daddy? When was this?" When you went shopping. Daddy came and we played games together." A small doubt sprouted in Margaret's mind. She did remember a day last week when she'd been away from home for a long time grocery shopping. Robert was supposed to be at work then. But from Ethan's story, it seemed her husband had come to the hospital. Why hadn't he told her about it? "That's wonderful. Did Daddy say anything else?" Margaret asked as naturally as possible while holding her son's hand. "Yes, he said to get better soon so we can all play together as a family," Ethan answered innocently. Margaret smiled, but something nagged at her deep down. Recently, Robert hadn't been coming to the hospital as often as before. The burden of caregiving fell almost entirely on Margaret's shoulders. While she could understand that her husband was busy with work, she couldn't help feeling that his interest in their son's treatment was waning. Through the hospital room window, she could see other patients' families enjoying walks in the courtyard. As Margaret watched them, she prayed that such peaceful days would return to her family. However, in a corner of her heart, she couldn't shake the anxiety that something had fundamentally changed. In the evening, after reading to her son, Margaret left the hospital. As she searched for her car keys in the parking lot, her cell phone rang. It was Robert. "How was it? How's Ethan doing?" Her husband's voice carried fatigue. "He was relatively well today. He was worried about you though," Margaret answered as she got into her car. "I see. I might be able to come home early tomorrow. Let's have dinner together." "That would be wonderful." "It's been a while," relief mixed into Margaret's voice. After hanging up, Margaret drove home thinking. She was probably just being too anxious. It was natural for the stress of their son's illness to affect their marriage as well. When November arrived, Ohio's climate turned harsh all at once. Every morning, Margaret looked at the frost-covered windows and worried whether they could get through this winter. Ethan's treatment was progressing well, but there was still a long road ahead before he would be completely cured. Around this time, Robert's behavior became even more puzzling. On a Saturday morning, as Margaret was preparing breakfast, Robert came downstairs wearing a suit. "It's the weekend, isn't it? Where are you going?" Margaret asked while frying eggs. "There's a problem at the construction site. I have to handle it just for the morning." Robert hurriedly drank his coffee. "I'll be back in the afternoon, then we can go to the hospital together." However, Robert didn't return home until after 7 in the evening. Seeing her exhausted husband enter through the front door, Margaret said nothing. She thought she understood the demands of the construction industry. But when this pattern continued almost every weekend, she couldn't help but have doubts. One afternoon, Margaret was spending time with Ethan at the hospital. Her son had lost his appetite due to chemotherapy side effects and seemed less energetic than usual. "Mommy, in my dream yesterday, I played in the park with my little sister," Ethan suddenly said. Margaret looked up from her book. "Little sister? Ethan, you don't have a sister." "But in my dream I had a sister. She was very kind and gave me flowers," Ethan said, staring at the ceiling. "Her name was Emma." Margaret smiled at her son's vivid imagination, but at the same time worried that the chemotherapy might be affecting his mental state. When she consulted with Dr. Wilson, the attending physician, he explained that it was common for children undergoing treatment to imagine fictional friends or family members. Due to stress and loneliness, children sometimes create beings that serve as emotional support. In Ethan's case, through the existence of a sister, he might be seeking a sense of family unity. While Margaret was convinced by the doctor's explanation, she became anxious again when Ethan began talking about Emma more frequently. Her son began giving detailed descriptions, talking specifically about what clothes Emma wore and what her voice sounded like. In the third week of November, Margaret was shopping at the neighborhood supermarket. As she was about to pay at the checkout, someone called to her from behind. "Margaret." Turning around, she found Linda, a friend from high school. The two were delighted by their unexpected reunion and chatted for a while. "How is Ethan doing?" Linda asked with concern. "Thanks to everyone, his treatment is progressing well," Margaret answered. "That's good to hear. Actually, I saw Robert last week. At a cafe near the hospital," Linda continued casually. "He was with a little girl, so I thought it was Ethan, but her hair color was different." Margaret's heart began racing. "A little girl?" "Yes, about 3 years old I'd say. She was a very cute child." "It was touching to see Robert speaking so gently to her," Linda continued innocently. "Maybe a relative's child." Margaret tried to hide her confusion. "Yes, that must be it." When Margaret got home, Linda's words wouldn't leave her mind. She couldn't think of any reason why Robert would be with a small girl. It might have been a co-worker's child, or perhaps a stranger's child he happened to encounter. But why hadn't he mentioned it to her? That night, when Robert came home, Margaret gathered her courage to ask. "I met Linda today. She said she saw you near the hospital with a little girl." Robert's hand stopped for a moment. He answered while removing his tie, "Oh, that was the daughter of a new client. After our meeting, I looked after her a little until her father came to pick her up." "I see." "I was worried," Margaret said, carefully observing her husband's expression. "There's no need to worry. It was just business." Robert kissed his wife's cheek and went to take a shower. Margaret tried to accept this explanation, but felt something unnatural about her husband's attitude. The old Robert would normally have talked about such an incident as conversation at home. The following Tuesday, Margaret was spending time with Ethan at the hospital. Her son had a slight fever but was in good spirits. "Mommy, when Daddy came yesterday, he told me about Emma," Ethan said innocently. Margaret's hand stopped. "Daddy? Yesterday?" "Yes, when you were at home. Daddy came and said Emma is a very hardworking girl." Margaret was confused. Yesterday afternoon, she had definitely been at home. She was doing laundry and cleaning, but hadn't received any communication that Robert was going to the hospital. Did Daddy say anything else? Margaret tried not to let her voice shake. Emma is seeing doctors just like me. But since she's smaller than me, she has to work even harder, Ethan said with a serious expression. Margaret tried to understand her son's words. It had become a story where a child named Emma actually existed and was receiving treatment at a medical facility. This went beyond the realm of an imaginary friend. That night, Margaret felt the urge to check Robert's cell phone call history. However, she reconsidered, thinking that going that far would betray her trust in her husband. Instead, she decided to ask directly. Ethan said you went to the hospital yesterday. Robert looked up from his newspaper. Yesterday? No, I didn't go. The meeting ran long, so I went straight home. But Ethan clearly said you came. Maybe Ethan's memory is getting fuzzy. The medication can have effects. Robert turned back to his newspaper. You shouldn't take children's stories too seriously. Margaret felt uncomfortable with her husband's reaction. The old Robert would have worried about their son's statements together with her. The current Robert seemed to be trying to avoid the topic. When December arrived, Ethan's stories about Emma became even more specific. Emma's favorite color was pink, she always carried a stuffed rabbit, and she was good at singing. Most puzzling of all was the story that Emma was also receiving treatment at the same hospital. Margaret asked at the nurse's station whether there was a patient named Emma. Due to privacy concerns, she couldn't get detailed information, but one of the nurses answered, yes, there is a cute little girl named Emma. At that moment, Margaret's world stood still. The Emma that Ethan had been talking about was a real person. And the person who knew details about this child was none other than her own husband. In the second week of December, Ethan's condition suddenly deteriorated. On Tuesday night, Margaret was awakened by an emergency call from the hospital. Her son's fever had risen to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and his white blood cell count had dropped to dangerous levels. Margaret rushed to the hospital in a panic. She tried calling Robert, but his cell phone went to voicemail. Ethan was moved to the intensive care unit and slept with an oxygen mask. Seeing the countless tubes connected to his small body, Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. It's possible he's developed an infection, Dr. Wilson explained with a serious expression. Because his immune system is extremely compromised, the next 48 hours will be critical. Margaret placed a chair beside her son's bed and continued nursing him without sleep. Around 6 in the morning, Robert finally appeared. His hair was disheveled and he was wearing the same clothes from the previous day. Sorry, my phone battery died and I didn't notice, Robert said breathlessly. How is he? Margaret looked into her husband's eyes. Where were you? I called at 1 in the morning. I was pulling an all-nighter at the office. A big project deadline was approaching. Robert peered at his son's face. More importantly, how is Ethan's condition? Margaret relayed the doctor's explanation to her husband. However, deep down she was thinking about something else. Robert's clothes carried a faint scent of women's perfume. It was clearly different from what she used. That afternoon, Ethan's fever dropped slightly, but his consciousness was still hazy. Margaret held her son's hand, waiting for him to wake up. Robert said he had an afternoon meeting and left the hospital after about an hour. In the evening, Ethan finally opened his eyes. He looked at Margaret and gave a weak smile. Mommy, I'm thirsty. Margaret called the nurse and gave her son a small amount of water. Ethan seemed to regain some energy and tried to sit up in bed. You still need to rest, Margaret gently laid her son back down. Mommy, I had a scary dream, Ethan gripped his mother's hand tightly. I was in a dark place, all alone. It's okay now. Mommy is here with you, Margaret stroked her son's forehead. Ethan was quiet for a while, but suddenly spoke up as if remembering something. Mommy, bring a toy for my sister." Margaret's hand stopped. She thought her son might be delirious from fever, but Ethan's eyes were clear and his consciousness seemed lucid. "Ethan, you don't have a sister," Margaret said gently. "But there's Emma," Ethan answered as if it were obvious. "Emma came to the hospital too. She was with Daddy before." Margaret's heart began pounding violently. "With Daddy? When?" When you were taking a nap at home," Ethan tried to remember while looking at the ceiling. "Daddy brought Emma and introduced her to me." Margaret desperately tried to understand her son's story. What was Emma like? She was very small with golden hair. And she was holding a stuffed rabbit, Ethan described in detail. "Daddy said Emma is sick just like me." Margaret's world began to crumble. The child named Emma that her son was talking about was clearly a real person. And Robert had secretly introduced this child to their son. "What did Emma say?" Margaret asked in a trembling voice. "She called me Big Brother," Ethan smiled happily. "And we promised to get better soon and play together." Margaret stood up and walked to the window. Snow was beginning to fall outside. If her son's story was true, Robert had a secret he was hiding. And that secret involved a small girl. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Ethan called out with concern. Margaret turned around and smiled at her son. "It's nothing. I'm just a little tired." "Mommy, please bring Emma a toy," Ethan said again. "Daddy said Emma doesn't have many toys and feels lonely." Margaret's chest ached at her son's pure kindness. Even though Ethan himself was fighting a serious illness, he was worried about another child. "I understand. I'll bring a toy next time," Margaret promised. That night, when Robert returned to the hospital, Margaret decided to talk with her husband while their son was sleeping. However, she felt she needed to gather more information before confronting him directly. "How is Ethan doing?" Robert asked quietly. "A little better. He wanted to talk with you," Margaret observed her husband's reaction. "I see. I'll come early tomorrow morning." Margaret hesitated, then decided to speak up. "Robert, have you ever told Ethan about other children?" Robert's expression tensed for a moment. "Other children? A girl named Emma. Ethan talks about her often." "Oh, that," Robert paused as if choosing his words. "I just told him about other patients I met at the hospital. It's good for children to encourage each other, isn't it?" Margaret wasn't satisfied with her husband's explanation. However, she decided it wasn't appropriate to pursue this further in front of their son. The next morning, Margaret asked about the patient named Emma at the nurse's station again. This time, she asked more specific questions. "Which ward is the little girl named Emma in?" "Emma is a patient in the cardiac unit," an elderly nurse answered. "She's a cute 3-year-old who comes for regular checkups." "The cardiac unit?" Margaret was surprised. "Yes, she has a congenital heart defect and is waiting for surgery. An adult man always accompanies her." Margaret's suspicions turned to certainty. A girl named Emma existed, and Robert was clearly taking care of this child. But why was he hiding this from her, and who was this child? When she returned to the room, Ethan was awake looking at a picture book in bed. When he saw his mother, he looked relieved. "Mommy, did you ask about Emma?" Margaret was torn about how to answer her son's innocent question. Her fear of learning the truth was complexly intertwined with her desire to protect her son. Margaret couldn't sleep all night. She tried to nap in Ethan's hospital room, but her son's story wouldn't leave her mind. The girl named Emma, the cardiac unit, and Robert's inexplicable behavior. All the pieces pointed to one terrifying possibility. The next morning, Margaret made up her mind to visit the hospital's administrative office. She asked the receptionist if she could review security camera footage. "I'm sorry, but due to privacy concerns, viewing footage requires a legitimate reason," the clerk explained politely. Actually, it seems my husband has been visiting our son without telling me, and there are discrepancies between my son's story and my husband's explanation. Margaret spoke seriously. I need accurate information to make decisions about my son's treatment plan. After consulting with her supervisor, the clerk allowed limited footage review. Margaret was permitted to view 2 weeks of entrance footage from the pediatric ward. The first few days of footage showed nothing unusual. However, in footage from last Tuesday around 2 p.m., Margaret's heart nearly stopped. The screen showed Robert entering the hospital holding hands with a small girl. The girl was blonde and, just as Ethan had described, was holding a stuffed rabbit. Behind them followed a young woman. This is... Margaret involuntarily spoke aloud. When she rewound and checked again, it was definitely Robert. And the woman was someone she didn't recognize. Margaret asked the clerk to check footage from other times that day. Around 4 p.m., there was footage of the same 3 people leaving the hospital. Robert was carrying the girl, talking with the woman. The scene looked like a family from every angle. Margaret took out her trembling cell phone and photographed that scene. She needed evidence. But at the same time, she felt crushed by the pain of accepting reality. When she returned to the room, Ethan was happily talking with a nurse. Seeing her son's innocent smile, Margaret felt tears welling up. This child knew nothing and was a victim of his father's double life. "Mommy, what's wrong? You look pale," Nurse Carol asked with concern. "I'm just a little tired," Margaret forced a smile. That afternoon, Margaret made a decision. She would wait for Robert to appear with Emma next time. She told Ethan she had some errands and left the room, waiting in the first-floor lobby. After 3 p.m., Margaret's intuition proved correct. Through the hospital's main entrance, Robert entered with a young woman and small girl. The girl certainly matched Ethan's description. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and carefully holding a stuffed rabbit. Margaret hid behind a pillar and observed the 3. Robert gently lifted the girl and whispered something to her. The woman placed her hand on Robert's arm, showing the intimacy of a wife. The 3 headed toward the cardiac unit. Margaret followed at a distance. At the cardiac unit reception, while the woman filled out some paperwork, Robert entertained the girl. "Emma, let's be good today too," Margaret heard Robert's voice. Margaret couldn't believe her ears. Robert was calling the girl Emma. And his tone clearly contained a father's affection. When the examination began, Robert and the woman sat in the waiting room talking. Margaret observed them from afar. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s, considerably younger than Robert. Between them was an intimacy that suggested a long-standing relationship. About an hour later, the examination ended and Emma returned. The girl was crying, but when Robert picked her up, she stopped crying as if comforted. "Daddy, it hurt," Emma's small voice could be heard. Margaret's world completely collapsed. Emma was calling Robert Daddy. This meant Robert had a daughter she knew nothing about. A doctor appeared and began talking with the 3. Margaret strained to listen, but with many medical terms, she couldn't understand the details. However, it was clear they were discussing Emma's heart surgery. When the 3 were leaving the hospital, Margaret decided to gather courage and call out to them. But her feet wouldn't move. Fear of accepting reality paralyzed her. In the end, Margaret could only watch the 3 leave. In the parking lot, Robert put the woman and child in the car and exchanged a farewell kiss. It was a husband and wife's parting kiss. When Margaret returned to the room, Ethan was waiting worriedly. "Mommy, you were gone for a long time. I'm sorry. My errand took longer than expected." Margaret gripped her son's hand. "Mommy, did you see Emma today?" Ethan asked innocently. Margaret couldn't answer her son's question. Instead, she answered vaguely, "I'm sure you'll see her soon." That night, when Robert appeared at the hospital, Margaret desperately tried to remain calm. Her husband talked with their son as if nothing had happened, discussing work. Margaret felt frightened by his natural acting. "You should go home early and rest today," Robert said. "I have an important meeting tomorrow, so I have to leave early in the morning." Margaret couldn't believe her husband's words. Tomorrow too, he would probably go to his other family. When Margaret got home, she searched Robert's study for any clues. In the back of a desk drawer, she found a small photograph. It showed Robert, Emma, and the woman she'd seen today together in a family photo. On the back was written, "Jessica, Emma, Daddy." Margaret sat down trembling, holding the photograph. Her husband had another family. And that family had been going on for years. The next morning, after Robert left, Margaret made up her mind to call a detective agency. There was no longer any room for doubt, but she needed legal evidence. Specifically, she needed to know details about the relationship between Emma and Robert, and his relationship with the woman named Jessica. The detective promised to report the investigation results within a week. However, in Margaret's heart, all the answers were already clear. Robert was leading a double life, and Emma was his secret child. And her son Ethan had unknowingly learned of his half-sister's existence. Most painful was that Emma was also suffering from a serious illness, and Robert had to pay for two children's treatment simultaneously. This explained all of his recent behavior. Weekend outings, late returns home, and avoiding visits to his son. Everything was to secure time with his other family. The detective's investigation report confirmed Margaret's expectations. Robert and Jessica had been in a relationship for 5 years, and Emma was 3 years old and Robert's biological daughter. Jessica had worked as a nurse but was currently on leave to focus on Emma's congenital heart disease treatment. By the end of January, Ethan's condition had improved dramatically. His response to chemotherapy was good, and doctors said he would likely be cleared for discharge. However, Margaret's heart wasn't clear. While rejoicing in her son's recovery, she had to make decisions about their family's future. On a snowy evening, Margaret finally felt it was time to face Robert. After Ethan fell asleep, the couple talked in the hospital waiting room. "Robert, we need to talk." Margaret placed the photograph on the table. The color drained from Robert's face. He remained silent for a long time, then sighed deeply. "How long have you known?" "Since Ethan started talking about Emma." "That child can't lie," Margaret answered quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Robert held his head in his hands. "I didn't want to hurt you. And when Ethan got sick, I lost the timing to tell you everything. Emma is sick too, isn't she? Congenital heart disease. She needs surgery, and the costs." Robert's voice was halting. "Jessica is raising her alone, and I have to support them." While listening to her husband's explanation, Margaret held complex emotions mixing anger and sympathy. "You were supporting two families simultaneously. I love you and Ethan. That's true. But Emma and Jessica are also my responsibility." The following week, Margaret met with a lawyer. She consulted about divorce proceedings but also conveyed that she wanted to prioritize the children's welfare. The relationship between Ethan and Emma especially needed careful consideration. In early February, Ethan was officially scheduled for discharge. The day before going home, Margaret had an important conversation with her son. "Ethan, Daddy and Mommy are going to live apart for a while." Ethan looked confused. "Why?" "Sometimes adults have difficult problems. But both Daddy and Mommy's love for you will never change." "What about Emma?" Ethan's question was pure. Margaret gripped her son's hand. "You can still be friends with Emma." To keep that promise, Margaret met Jessica for the first time a week later. The two met at a neutral location, a coffee shop. Jessica looked younger than Margaret had imagined and appeared exhausted. "Emma's surgery is scheduled for next month," Jessica spoke modestly. "Emma always talked about Ethan. I see. Ethan was worried about Emma too, Margaret answered with mixed feelings. The two women quietly talked about their respective situations. They could have hated each other, but both prioritized their children's happiness. When spring arrived, a new rhythm of life was established. Margaret and Ethan lived in their original home, and Robert visited his son on weekends. Once a month, time was also arranged for Ethan and Emma to spend together. One Sunday afternoon, watching Ethan and Emma play in the park, Margaret understood a new truth. Family isn't defined only by blood relations. It's created by love, responsibility, and choice. Ethan recovered completely, and Emma's surgery was successful. The two children were bound by a pure connection that transcended the complicated circumstances of the adults. Margaret began a new life. She returned to work as a librarian, and while treasuring time with her son, she also began pursuing her own happiness. Her relationship with Robert was no longer that of husband and wife, but they chose to continue cooperating as parents of two children. The shape of their family had changed, but love was never lost. As each walked their new path, the children's smiles continued to be at the center of everything.